Lord Fowler, as I understand your statement and indeed the evidence we've heard from other ministers, the route to a minister for a civil servant was through the private office, is that right?
Yes, mostly. I mean, there's no reason why anyone couldn't ask for an individual personal meeting with a minister, and sometimes they did, but it was relatively rare. But normally, yes, it would be through the private office.
Now, as we look at various documents in the course of your evidence, we'll see examples of matters that were raised with you and examples of matters that were not raised with you at the time. What was the criteria for something coming to your attention as Secretary of State?
Well, obviously, if it was directed to the Secretary of State, if the minute was to the Secretary of State, then that was directed to me, and then directed to a whole range of other people as well. If I was simply being copied in, that it was a matter of judgment, I think, really, to the private office on whether it was something that was important that I should see or not important. And, you know, doubtless mistakes were made in that. But on the other hand, given that we were dealing with the whole of health and social security, I mean, we had to have some means of pruning it all out.
Now, lots of the documents that you've referred to in your statement didn't even make it to the private office. So the civil servant writing the minute or the ministerial submission had decided not to either copy it or send it directly to your private office, but to send it internally to other civil servants or to send it to Lord Glenarthur or Mr. Clark or whoever it might be. Were there any criteria or guiding principles as to when something should go to a particular ministerial level and when it shouldn't?
I don't think so entirely in that way. I mean, there were. I'm slightly surprised actually to see all the correspondence that was going on between, particularly between in the medical division, as we were going forward, which wasn't copied to me. So I don't think there was any particular criteria as far as that was concerned.
Now, you said, I think, in your statement, this is my paraphrase rather than your precise words, but when you became Secretary of State, you were effectively expected to hit the ground running. There was no system of you being briefed on all the issues that might come up over the coming year or anything like that. Is that right?
Yeah, that's totally right, because no other way of doing it. You didn't have the luxury of, I mean, I noticed when Donald took over as CMO from Henry Yellowlees, he had a 3-month introductory period. Well, it'd been marvellous if we'd been able to have 3-month introductory periods, but it wasn't possible. And if you take my example, I mean, not only did we have a strike in '82, but we did have this kind of Falklands War taking place as well. So it just isn't possible to actually say to a Secretary of State, well, you've now got a couple of months in which you can get yourself absolutely up to speed on all the issues in this department. And it's just a fact of life. No more than, and it's the same today. I mean, I imagine that the international secretary, the development secretary has now become the foreign secretary, isn't briefed on all the things that are taking place in the foreign office. Same with us.
And you say in your statement you think it relatively unlikely that you would have received any specific briefing on blood safety or the blood transfusion.
I don't remember any. I mean, it's extremely difficult because, you know, I'm sure this is a point that you is more pain for you than it is probably even for me. But I mean, the way that records have been kept has not been comprehensive. I could put it very much more strongly than that. So it's very difficult to tell, frankly.
And we'll come back to some aspects of that later again. In terms of keeping on top of issues then, you'd be dependent upon the judgment of the civil servants as to what should come to your private office and the judgment of your private office as to what should come to you.
Yes.
And then In terms then of you being notified of an issue, it would either be through that route, civil service and private office, or perhaps because something was going to be reported in the media.
Yes, it might be. It might be through that means, and also, I mean, the permanent secretary wants to see me on a particular issue. Just personal, or minister wants to see me. I'm not quite sure that I would have actually individual meetings with the communications department. I mean, there would be issues which would have come up and which they would be represented, or they'd be there, but I don't think that I had meetings of that kind. I did have a special advisor, Nick True, who's now a minister himself, but I only had one advisor for the whole of the department. I leave you to look up how many they have today.
In terms of regular meetings, was there any system of regular meetings for the ministers? So would you meet with your Minister of State Health and Parliamentary Under-Secretaries?
Yes, we tried to have regular meetings, always quite difficult because everyone, constituencies are all over the place. And if you had a meeting, I'd like to have a sort of 12 o'clock meeting on Monday mornings. But that did mean for some people getting there in time from wherever they happen to be. But that's what we tried to do. And then we would go on to lunch afterwards in the local cafe, and ministers would come there and talk informally, apart from John Major, who didn't like what are they called, these sorry, I've lost the description for them, but it will come to me. There was a particular part of the menu that he wasn't keen on, so he didn't come.
So you try and have they were informal meetings, effectively, where people could brainstorm. Or
no, that was the social meeting afterwards. And but then someone could say, "Look, I mean, this is going right, or this is going terribly wrong." You could say that informally without anyone being there. And from memory, I also had the top of, but I need to correct. I'm subject to correction on this. I think I had the top of the office. When I say the top of the office, probably I had Ken Stowe and people like that with me for the Monday meeting, rather than trying to have yet another division in all this. So we were both together. But Ken wouldn't have come, Ken Stowe wouldn't have come to lunch with us.
So there was an opportunity for both in a relatively formal sense, then in an informal setting, for issues or concerns to be raised with you. Yeah,
and remember, we were all MPs as well, and so they could raise, they could be raised over meals, etc., etc. I mean, it was there shouldn't have been any lack of connection between ministers.
Would it be right to say that to a considerable extent, your role, and indeed the role of other ministers, was a reactive one? You would be reacting to the submissions or issues raised with you by civil servants?
No, not really. I mean, it would be reactive, obviously, but my view had always been, it had been in transport, and it certainly was in health and social security. My role was to make policy as creatively as one possibly could do, and therefore, when it came to health, for example, I decided that we wouldn't have yet another reorganisation of the health service, which we'd had several before, but we'd concentrate on better management. Hence, we had Roy Griffiths. Even more, because it's not blood, but I mean it's not health, but it is the other side of my department. Remember, this is the other half of my life. We set up a inquiry, first of all, into pensions, and then it became an inquiry into the whole of the social security system. Now, that is a very ambitious thing to set up, but that's what we did. And what I did for that was to go out myself. So rather than a select committee coming in and interviewing the minister went out and interviewed the public. And I think it's the first time that had been attempted. And so that took a lot of time to organise, but it was worthwhile. So there were all kinds of initiatives that we were taking. I mean, obviously, there's the bread and butter stuff, in as much as issues come to you, come up through the system. But I think that from my point of view, the real test of a Secretary of State is what he is initiating. And I hope I initiated some things in health, and I hope I initiated things in pensions and in social security.
Now, although you may not have had a briefing or an initial briefing on blood safety or blood transfusion, would you expect the system within the department to have been that the minister with specific responsibility for that area would, fairly soon after taking up their post, be given that kind of briefing?
Yes.
Can you recall, and there's no particular document to which I can direct you to prompt your memory in relation to this, but can you recall in those first years in the 80s in your role, what, if anything, you knew about the risks of hepatitis from blood or blood products?
Not a great deal, I have to admit, but to begin with, I knew a little more as it developed, but much more on HIV than it was on hepatitis.
And do you recall what your understanding was of the potential severity of hepatitis?
Well, it could be very severe indeed, and therefore needed to be taken seriously. And it was rather a forgotten subject, I found, in the public discourse upon this. But this was something which the health ministers had their eye on and surveyed.
And then do you recall having any particular knowledge about the significance of the way in which blood products were made in terms of large pool sizes, large numbers of donations, and the interrelationship between that and risk?
Well, at this point it becomes quite difficult to distinguish between what I knew then and what I know now by reading and by experience over the days. But yes, I did understand that, and I did understand, the risk of pooled contributions and all that, and also some of the detail about injecting and the rest. But I was not I was not employed as a medical health expert. I did have health ministers, and we did, of course, have a medical division. But I tried to keep myself sort of up to date on that, and obviously with AIDS, I took the leading part.
Just to go back to the question of finite financial resources and spending constraints, you've described your battles with the Treasury. You've described health as being probably the bloodiest battleground in British politics. Do you have any insight as to why that might be the case?
Oh, it goes back to the inception of the National Health Service. And it was introduced, as you know, by Nye Bevan and the Labour Party. The Conservative Party made the profound mistake of distancing themselves from it, if not opposing it. And from that moment onwards, it was hung round our neck that we had opposed it. And it was also a cause of the Labour Party. So it was highly political. That was the answer. Labour, standing for the health service, Conservatives desperately tried to catch up on that early mistake. The truth is that advances in the health service were made by both parties, and that's the truth of the matter is. But when you get to general elections, that truth gets put to one side.
In terms of the battles with the Treasury, in
Yep.
terms of funding, were there particular types of argument or consideration that might find favour with the Treasury to resist spending cuts or to obtain increased spending?
I don't think they minded what. I don't think they mind. They were totally open to argument on what cuts could be made, and if some Secretary of State came forward with a plan to cut in a particular area, they wouldn't stand in the way. I mean, it was that kind of. I mean, it's very difficult, I think, to understand that now. We are talking about the 1980s. Indeed, I think you probably talk about it in the 1970s as well, because in both periods, governments were under very tight financial restrictions, and any proposals, new proposals which the Treasury hadn't thought of, would be gratefully received. But in the main, the proposals came from them that there should be new charges, for example. That was a very popular one from the Treasury, even though we were almost invariably pledged against it in party manifestos. But that's why I call it a kind of rather bloody time as far as politics is concerned. I mean, it was, everything was thrown at you.
To what extent would issues of public safety, of risk to health, to what extent would those kind of matters weigh with the Treasury if you were asking for or putting in your bid for money?
Difficult to say. I mean, sometimes just to take my experience from AIDS, for example, for a moment. I mean, most of the things I did in AIDS, I didn't get any extra money at all from the Treasury. I mean, that's often forgotten. You know, we did this massive campaign, but it came from the resources inside the department, inside the health budget. And I remember very distinctly when we were going to send a leaflet round to all homes in the country, warning them about AIDS. We got this through by this stage, special committee on AIDS. And then right at the end, the Chief Secretary said, and of course, I do have to say that all this is on the understanding that no extra resources will come from us. And that was generally their attitude. So they were not a social reforming department.
I want to then turn to a specific piece of information by way of an example of communication with the public, and it's the issue about the whooping cough vaccine, to which you've already made some reference. If we could have up on screen, please, Seamus, WITN 0771002. So this is a press release dated the 1st of September 1982, increasing number of whooping cough cases, Norman Fowler's statement. And then it reads, Norman Fowler, Secretary of State for Social Services, issued the following statement today on the publication of the latest weekly figures on the number of cases of whooping cough. Mr. Fowler said, these are very disturbing figures. They show that the number of cases of whooping cough are still on the increase and could well go higher over the next few months. There have already been over 30,000 cases of whooping cough this year, and some babies have died. This underlines the case for immunisation. In the years when the majority of babies were being vaccinated against the disease, whooping cough was kept in check, but in the last 6 years, less than half the babies who could have been vaccinated have received the benefit of this preventive measure. Both as Secretary of State and as a parent, I can appreciate why some parents have felt reservations about vaccinating their children, but extensive research has shown that there is considerably greater risk to babies and young children of severe illness and lasting complications from the disease, even of death, than of reaction to the vaccination itself. The risk of an unvaccinated child contracting the disease is between 1 in 6 and 1 in 30, and that of a child dying is 1 in 3,000. The risk of irreversible brain damage from whooping cough vaccination is estimated at about 1 in 100,000 children immunised. It's customary to think of vaccination against whooping cough in relation to babies in the early months of life, and then you talk about the possibility of the vaccination being given at a later stage than babyhood. I urge parents to consider taking young children to their family doctor or local clinic to consult about the desirability of vaccinating them now. As recently as last winter, I warned parents of the dangers of leaving children unprotected by vaccination and encouraged health authorities to run publicity campaigns locally to encourage parents to consider vaccination. There are encouraging signs that uptake of vaccination has been increasing, and then you give further details and say that that's still not really good enough. You sincerely hope parents are now thinking carefully about getting their children protected before the disease becomes more prevalent. So it would look from this as though this was not your first statement. You issued a previous statement the winter of 1981 and then followed it up in the autumn of 1982. And is it right to understand this is the department giving information to the public, or to a sector of the public, parents of children, about the dangers of a disease, about the benefits or the steps that can be taken to prevent that disease, and you set out the department's assessment of risk?
It's much more a part of a campaign that I ran myself, or took part in running, to try and increase the vaccination rate. And it was influenced, as you remember, by my trip to Birmingham Children's Hospital and taking it on from there. It was influenced by one other thing, and that was that I had a daughter of exactly the same age, and we had to decide, was she going to be vaccinated? We decided that she should be, and then we decided that we would put it on, if you like, on television. We had television cameras there. So we did our utmost to persuade people to vaccinate their children. That was the purpose of it. So it was not a, if you like, a standard Department of Health press release. It was a part of a campaign of my own to following on Birmingham to try and increase numbers.
So would it be right to understand it's a specific campaign in response to a perceived public health risk?
Yes.
The purpose of which is to enable people to be better informed and take better informed decisions.
Yes.
And you say in your statement, just could get the statement up on screen, Shamik. If we go to page 8, and we pick it up in paragraph 0.9, the penultimate sentence, you say, the department and its expert advisors saved lives amidst a media storm. And is it right to understand that the claim you make there for the saving of lives is saving lives by providing comprehensive information to the public so that they could take informed decisions? Okay.
And urging, not just information, but urging them to do so. And by simply by the fact that I was Secretary of State, and simply by the fact that my daughter Kate was of the same age, I could actually take an obviously personal interest in that.
Now, again, I'll pick up on the theme of public communication,
Sure.
obviously, when we come to AIDS, but that was one of your early initiatives. Then I just want to turn to what you say in your witness statement next about your role, your legal role as licensing authority. So if we turn, please, to the statement at page 34, Shamik. You explain at the bottom of that page that as Secretary of State, you were the licensing authority, but decisions were taken under delegated power, so you would not normally be personally involved, nor would the other ministers. Now, just so that others can understand what you're saying in your statement, is this right, The licensing authority comprised in law you, your colleagues in Ireland, Scotland and Northern Ireland, and I think the Secretary of State for Agriculture, Fisheries and Food.
Yes, I think that's right.
So in law, you as ministers were the licensing authority, but in practice, you didn't take any decisions in relation to licensing.
That's right.
And then you've set out, if we go to the next page, please, Shomik. You've set out an outline of your understanding of the licensing regime. I'm not going to go through it all in detail. We see the reference there in subparagraph 3 to your fellow ministers who also comprise the licensing authority. But in terms of your delegated powers, they were, as I understand your statement, effectively exercised by the Medicines Division within the Department of Health. There were then a range of statutory committees, including the Committee on the Safety of Medicine and its Biological Subcommittee, from whom advice could be taken or to whom decisions could be referred. And then there was scope for appeal to the Medicines Commission. Is that broadly your
I think that's broadly right, yes.
Now, we'll be looking at that in other documents and with other witnesses, hopefully. But you yourself then didn't actually have any knowledge of the licensing process or any involvement?
No, I had no part in it, really, no.
Do you know to whom the Medicines Division was accountable or who had oversight of it?
I would have said the Medicines Division was accountable to the Chief Medical Officer, but that would be my assessment.
And do you know the extent to which the work of the Medicines Division within your department applied or affected Scotland, Wales and Northern Ireland, or whether there were separate systems in those territories?
I can't remember that, but I can't believe that they were very separate, frankly, because it wouldn't make sense for them to be so.
And I think you don't recall licensing decisions relevant to blood products ever coming to you. Do you recall any decisions relating to licensing ever coming to you?
No, not really.
There's a report which you have exhibited to your statement. Shomik, could we have WITN 0771006? We can see it's called Study of Control of Medicines. It's a report by Dr. Evans and P. Cunliffe. On the bottom of the page, we can see the date is December 1987, which I think is after you have left office. But if we go to page, sorry, Shomik, 10. We can see under the heading Introduction, Chapter 1, it says, in the spring of 1987, the Medicines Act 1968 was almost 20 years old. And the Medicines Division of DHSS, which is the government department charged with implementation of licensing of medicines under the Act, was showing signs of overload. We were asked by ministers to study the arrangements for the control of medicines with the following terms of reference. And then we can see the terms of reference were to examine the issues for DHSS arising from the continued increases in licence applications and other work under the Medicines Act, and to recommend ways of dealing expeditiously with this work while maintaining adequate standards for the safety, efficacy and quality of human medicines in the United Kingdom. So this report or this study was commissioned whilst you were still Secretary of State.
Yeah.
Do you recall whether you had any involvement in that?
I don't think I did.
Well, in that case, as the report was then presented after you'd left office, I think we'll leave that for consideration at a later stage. I want to turn then to the question of self-sufficiency in blood products and the redevelopment of BPL, the Blood Products Laboratory.
Yep.
Now, you've given us a very detailed account in your statement of the chronological decision-making process from essentially 1980 or thereabouts onwards. I'm not going to go through it document by document or paragraph by paragraph with you, Lord Fowler, because I think for the most part you weren't involved in the decisions. There are a handful of matters I'll explore with you by reference to the documents. But before we do that, what was your understanding, if any, of the government's policy on self-sufficiency when you took up your post as Secretary of State for Health?
Well, when I took it over to begin with, it developed really in the first few months, and it comes into the development of the blood products laboratory, and the fact is that by the time I had got there in September 1981, it was really too late for me to influence the outcome. I try to explain that. The crucial failure in BPL and the development of BPL was in the 1970s. If David Owen's advice had been taken and we'd gone for self-sufficiency as a nation, then much of the ensuing tragedy, probably not all of it, but much of it, could have been avoided. But governments decided that wasn't to be. The advice, broadly speaking, wasn't taken. I mean, had it been taken in, I don't know, 1975, 1976, then the outcome would have been very different indeed. So it wasn't taken then, and I don't know what the last date to have any effect would be, but arguably you could put in 1979 as well. But why September 1981 was too late to influence events was basically this. In 1985, we had both heat-treated blood introduced, and we also had screening. And so by 1985, we'd largely, at that stage, eradicated, not entirely, but largely eradicated the issue. There's no way that in the autumn of '81 there was anything that I could have done, or my department could have done, to influence the outcome, because however you measure BPL and its progress, there was, I think, no way that it could have been up and running. A decision made in 1981, even on my first day, could have affected the outcome in 1985. It just wasn't possible to do, and that is the fact of the matter. So I was very late on to come into this area. That's why I say that the real tragedy was that it wasn't done in the 1970s, and had it been done, it would have been different. I just trouble you with, I don't know if you've got this, but trouble you with a quotation from David Owen back in January of, it's Hansard, January 1975, in which, I don't know if you've got that.
Might do, if you just give me a moment.
I think you probably have, because it's probably what was sent to me.
It may be LDOW 5032.
It's 22nd of January 75, Hansard.
It's an answer to parliamentary questions.
That's right.
We'll just see if we have it on the screen to display. If not, I'll ask you to read it out. What was the date?
22nd of January 75.
Shomik, you might have it at DHSC 40274.
As I say, there is another reference
Yes,
There
it
we
is.
are.
And if we go to the second page, I don't know whether this is what you're referring to or not, Lord Fowler, but there's a bottom of the page is a statement from Dr. Owen.
No, that's
No, sorry, no, that's
It includes the words, I believe it is vitally important that the NHS...
sorry, bottom of the first page.
Go back. Go back a page, please, Shomik.
Yes,
yes,
top of
that's
the
right.
second
It's
page.
exactly that.
That's the last paragraph, possibly. Is that the paragraph you had in mind?
That is exactly right, and particularly the last sentence. I believe it. Well, first sentence is, I believe it is vitally important. You've got it. It's there. That the National Health Service should become self-sufficient as soon as practicable in the production of factor VIII, including HG concentrates. This will stop us being independent of imports and make
Dependent, I think. on
sorry,
imports.
being dependent on imports and make the best known treatment more readily available. And he's authorised special finance to boost our own production with the objective of becoming self-sufficient over the next few years. That was said in 75, and in 1976 there was a DHSS press release.
So is that the 29th of April 1970?
Well done, it's exactly that. Yes.
LDOW 5044, please, Shomik.
And you will see in that
LDOW 5044. Oh, okay. Well, I've got it. I'm afraid we haven't got it to display on screen. Do you want to
okay,
read
well,
that?
but basically what the headline on it is, UK aims to be self-sufficient in supply of blood products, 12th of April 1976, and it quotes David Owen as saying, self-sufficiency in home-produced factor VIII was expected to be reached in mid-1977. So, and incidentally, I'm not blaming David Owen. I'm sure David Owen, it's the trouble with all us health ministers, is that we all get blamed for this or that, when often it is simply the Treasury not providing the finance. And I think this is what has happened in this case. But had we done it at that period, there is I think no question at all that much of the later tragedy could have been avoided. And that's the point. And the second point is simply to say, with the best will in the world, September 1981, we could not have done it. It just wasn't physically possible to have completed this programme so that it would have affected anything before we had screening and heat-treated blood. I mean, that is just it seems to me just a fact of life.
As I understand your statement, Lord Fowler, and if we look first of all at the period prior to Mrs. Thatcher's government being elected in May of '79, you don't know why self-sufficiency was not achieved or earlier decisions were not taken in that period prior to May of 1979.
I could guess. And it's the familiar, I think it's pretty informed guess. It's the problem of finance. We were coming out of the IMF and all that stuff, but it wasn't high on the priority list. I mean, it wasn't a massive bit of additional spending. We weren't commissioning Trident or anything. I mean, it was pretty small spending, but it wasn't considered to be high enough in the priorities. And that was also same, to be fair, when we took power in 1979, when the department were being asked, you must make further economies, And, you know, the reply to that was probably, I imagine, what Jerry Vaughan and people were saying was, well, we can't actually make a new bid for BPL. So I don't know if it would have made any difference in 79. It certainly would have made difference in 1975 to 77.
We explored in some detail with Dr. Wolford the documents in relation to the decision-making between 1979 and 1981, indeed 1982. I know you've seen extracts from her evidence, Lord Fowler. I'm not proposing to go to individual parts of it unless it would assist you. But broadly speaking, she was very critical of there being a delay from the adverse medicines inspection report in April of 1979 through to decision being taken eventually late 1981, in principle to redevelop BPL, and then a further year or so to the autumn of 82 before there was a more detailed, worked up planning. Do you have any knowledge of or insight into why there was that delay from 1979 onwards? So your government, although you weren't Secretary of State for Health.
No, I have no knowledge of that. I don't know. If there was delay, I imagine it was again the financial delay. You had a government that had been elected so it's interpreted, by the government, to control public spending. And, you know, if you're controlling public spending, the least popular thing to do is to say, I've got a new venture to put forward. But as I say at the beginning, it all has to be under the umbrella that in 1979 it's highly doubtful whether it would have had any effect. Certainly in 1981 it most certainly wouldn't have had any effect.
Well, the question of whether 1979 would have had an effect will obviously be a matter for the Chair to consider in due course. If we just look at your statement, please, Seamus, at page 75. This is your recollection of what you might have known about self-sufficiency policy. So I'll just read it out for the benefit of those who haven't had the opportunity to read the statement. I strongly suspect, so this is the last paragraph, Seamus, that I did know about the self-sufficiency policy, at least in general terms, for my period as opposition spokesman. However, I cannot recall exactly what level of detail I was aware of when I became Secretary of State, taking over from Patrick Jenkin. What I do remember is that I certainly knew about the redevelopment of BPL and the need for self-sufficiency shortly after becoming Secretary of State, when the Cabinet got down to reviewing public spending following the 1981 reshuffle. Every piece of spending was reviewed at that time, and that would have included the £17 million plan for the redevelopment of BPL. In this spending review, there was fierce pressure for cuts in health spending. Although I do not have any direct recollection now, I must have agreed with the redevelopment of BPL and self-sufficiency because it was not given up as a saving at this time. It would be easy for the inquiry to overlook the fact that against the intense pressures to make cuts, the mere act of protecting existing spending plans was a significant positive decision at this stage. So that's your recollection of the extent to which you knew about the policy and the plan.
Yes, well, it is. But again, I have to say that it must have been considered. And, you know, we're again exploring in the dark a bit on this because I gather there aren't any papers on it. But the 1979 government, as it came into power, was under a lot of pressure to cut spending. And in this 81-82 round, we were under, for some reason, under even more pressure to cut spending. Can't remember the political position then. So we had to make a positive decision about whether we would continue to press for the £17 million planned for the redevelopment of BPL. What had happened in the meantime is that Patrick Jenkin had made a commitment in principle that we would provide the money, but no decision had at that stage been taken about how that would go forward or whether that would actually go forward. But we did decide that it should go forward, and we stuck on that path up until completion, despite a number of knocks along the way.
And if we just go over to the top of the next page, please, Shamik. You've said in this paragraph, and this was in response to being asked if you knew of Lord Owen's statements, it should be remembered that ministers of one party do not have access to the papers of the party they're replacing. I cannot recall specific statements on the floor of the House, although I have some recollection of Roland Moyle, one of his successors, so one of Lord Owen's successors, coming under criticism for not putting the words into a definite policy. I do not have any knowledge of the extent to which substantial funds were devoted to bringing self-sufficiency into practice before the approval of funds that had been agreed shortly before I became Secretary of State. Do you have any further recollection of the...
Not really. I just do remember Roland Moyle, who was Secretary of State after... No, he wasn't. He was Minister of State to David Ennals. And I do remember that he did come under criticism on these grounds, but I haven't done a trawl of Hansard to find out exactly. And indeed, it might not even be in Hansard. But certainly it was in the public arena, not massively in the public arena, but it was in the public arena that this should be done. And it was a great pity that David Owen's statements were not followed.
Just want to ask you to look at just a handful of documents in relation to this period of time. If they aren't all documents you'd have seen at the time, and I'll try and make clear as we look at them which ones you may or may not have seen. If we could go to DHSC 0002211_062. And if we go to the next page. This is a note of a meeting between the Minister of State for Health and representatives of the Haemophilia Society on the 21st of October 1981. So it's shortly after you've taken up your role, but not a meeting which you attended, and probably not a document you'd have seen at the time.
I think it would have been attended by Jerry Vaughan, wouldn't it?
I think that's right. There's no... I think there's nothing to suggest that you'd have seen this at the time. Just want to ask you whether you can assist us in understanding what might have been meant by what we see at paragraph 2. It says the haemophilia... So this is a discussion of a meeting between the Minister, Dr. Vaughan, and the Haemophilia Society. And we say here, it says the Haemophilia Society accepted that self-sufficiency should only be aimed for if it could be shown to be economic to do so. Now, leave aside what the Haemophilia Society did or didn't accept, Lord Fowler, I'm not asking you about that, but do you have any understanding of what might be meant there by this suggestion that self-sufficiency should only be aimed for if it could be shown to be economic to do so?
No, I think it's a fairly odd interpretation of probably what the Haemophilia Society were urging, because basically it seems to be, if the best interpretation on it is self-sufficiency should only be aimed for if the national economy could afford it. That's the best one. But what it should shown to be economic to do so is, I have absolutely no idea. I assume that is the Haemophilia Society or the person who has actually written this leaning over backwards to say that the society agreed with the government's policy. It's query, I would have thought that.
If we go to one further document, WITN 4461055. This is a submission to ministers dated the 17th of November 1981. So it's, again, your Secretary of State, but it's not a submission that goes to your private office, as I understand it. We can see in the paragraph numbered 1, background, the last sentence explains what this document is. This paper seeks ministers' agreement to the department consulting the NHS about the level to which it can increase the supply of plasma. So that's the background. Just wanted to draw your attention to paragraph 2. It says the principle of self-sufficiency in blood and blood products promulgated by the World Health Organization has been endorsed by successive governments. Ministers have agreed that we should seek to reduce as far as possible the NHS's dependence upon commercial blood products, the importation of which is not only costly to the NHS, about £10 million a year, but also poses health risks in terms of potential hepatitis infection. So there are two arguments for self-sufficiency there being articulated. A financial argument, it's going to save us money, because in the long run we won't be spending large amounts of public money on commercial products. Secondly, health risks in terms of potential hepatitis infection. Do you recall any discussion within the department or within government when you were Secretary of State about those two objectives and whether one was regarded as more important than the other?
No, not... well, I recall that we had discussion about self-sufficiency and that you could make the case that if you if you managed to knock out importation, so after all one part of the case, that this would actually lead to a saving in the long term. I certainly remember that. But I am tempted to say that the idea that the principle of self-sufficiency in blood and blood products promulgated by the WHO has been endorsed by successive governments. Well, it might have been endorsed, but the principle might have been endorsed, but actually it needed a bit of action on the principle. We needed to take action, we needed to start building. And that didn't happen until I got there in 1981. Didn't start happening until the following year, in 82. I mean, you know, it was a lengthy process.
Now,
Too long.
Again, we covered this with Dr. Wolford, and arguably there may have been a delay between the decision in principle to redevelop towards the end of 1981 and the decision in September, October of 1982 to ask the Treasury for approval about how to spend money in concrete terms. I don't think there's any evidence of you being involved in the decision-making during that first year of office. Are you able to assist with understanding as to what was being considered on the ground within the department at that stage?
No, I can't really. I think that we were just, we were getting it all into, there wasn't a neat blueprint for us to do. It had to be, you had to start and make the plans. And so I think that was making the plans, to put it in the most broad and generalized way, for BPL. And then the case after that was whether they were going to consistently continue to finance it. And that we did do, irrespective of the fact that there were a number of increases. But that's about the best I can do on that.
Now,
just a moment. I just want to clarify with you something which you said, as I heard it, see whether I'm right or not, because the transcript has got it as unclear. This is describing, just going back to 12:49:55 for the point of view of the transcript. You were saying it was a lengthy process.
Have I got that here?
And then I think you added the words,
is that up on
too
the
long.
screen?
it's not, no.
Is it
No, Lord Fowler doesn't have the transcript.
Right, you didn't have the transcript, but I think what you said, as I heard it, was it was a lengthy process, that's describing the process you've just been talking about. Then you added, I think, the words, too long. Am I right in that recollection?
If you would remind me of what I said then.
Well, I will if I can get it back, but I'm not sure I... Yep.
I think I was trying to indicate was it was too...
I think you were saying it was too long.
It was too, yes, I think, yes, thank you. I think it was trying to indicate that it was too long to get to the process, to get to the decision, to get to the green light as far as BPL was concerned. And the green light was activated by Patrick Jenkin in the autumn, I think, well, a few months before I took over. And then we then had to plan out what exactly that meant. So as well as money, we had to actually plan out what exactly were the decisions that came up. The too long process is really a description of the whole back part.
Thank you.
Now, it would appear from the documents and from your statement that your first direct involvement in issues relating to blood and blood products came in around the spring of 1982. If we can look at DHSC 0101 561_003. And you'll see, Lord Fowler, this is a written answer, 3rd of March 1982. It's about the National Heart Hospital use of blood. And you're asked if you'd received a report of the Committee of Inquiry set up by the Board of Governors of the National Heart Hospital into the use of blood. And then your answer is, I've now studied carefully the report from the Board of Governors of the National Heart and Chest Hospitals, which my friend, the Minister for Health, requested following allegations in the press in October 1980 about misuse of blood and blood products. The report reveals serious defects in procedures at the hospital, which are now being rectified by the Board of Governors. The report also suggests that there's a need for improvements in record-keeping procedures in the blood transfusion service, and I'm arranging for these procedures to be looked at urgently. The report, however, also indicated the possibility of illegal action, and I've therefore referred the report to the Director of Public Prosecutions. I wish to assure the public, and particularly all those who give their blood for use through the National Blood Transfusion Service, that we shall do everything necessary to maintain the integrity of that service. It's a vital part of our health service, and I hope there'll be continued growth in donations, which last year exceeded 2 million. There was an issue, and indeed it did result in referral to the Director of Public Prosecutions and prosecutions, and I think convictions as well, about selling of blood or blood products. Can you assist us with understanding why this was, as it were, your introduction as Secretary of State to the world of blood safety and blood transfusion? Why were you being involved in this?
Give me it again, will you?
Yes, certainly. You're here giving a response to this report. Why had this come to you as Secretary of State?
Because I was giving the response to a very serious case, which might even go to the DPP, and I think it was certainly been my view that would have been given at the highest possible level. It all took place before my time. It took place in 1980, but it was important that we should put down as authoritative a statement as we possibly could do so.
So was it essentially because of the possibility of criminal proceedings or reputational issues relating to the national...
I think it was just a question of good government, really. I mean, you would expect the Secretary of State to make a statement of that kind, and if there had been a private notice question on the floor of the House, I think probably I would have answered it. It might have been Ken, but probably I would have answered it. But I think that it just gave it about as, it gave it as much authority as we could from the Department of Health. And we were, after all, clearing up an issue which, from memory, was the early part of 1980.
So I note the time. The next matter I want to ask Lord Fowler about involves looking at 5 or 6 documents. So it'll take a little while, so it might be easier to do that after lunch.
Very well. Well, we'll take a break now until 1:10. That should give
1:10.
2. Thank you. Yes. Don't get me wrong on that, please. 2:10. Thank you.